Recently I reviewed the Lian Li Q58 Mini ITX case and I liked it. I didn't think it was perfect. In particular, organising cables and cooling inside the case I found to be problematic. During that video I said I'd take a second look at the Q58, and this is the start of that process. As I've dismantled the system, I'm changing a few components. Starting with the motherboard, I originally used this Gigabyte B450i, and I'm switching to this Gigabyte B550i. And the reason for that, as someone pointed in the comments, was that I praised the PCI Express Gen 4 riser, but of course with the B450i, the graphics are actually running on Gen 3. So with this board and the RX 6800 XT and the Gen 4 riser, it'll be Gen 4 end to end. Next up, I'm going to give air cooling a try. I briefly showed you this Noctua air cooler in that first review. This is a supported cooler in the sense it can fit inside this incredibly compact chassis. So I'm going to try air cooling and see how well or otherwise it works. And then we have AIO cooling. Originally I used this 240mm Fractal AIO, which fitted but only just. The thing is, in the user guide, Lian Li shows some very careful routing of the hoses. They have to basically go down the side of the RAM, double back on themselves. However, on this cooler, the hoses are on these pivots, and they don't flex as easily at these points because it's all rigid and reinforced to provide strength, which I would typically regard to be a good thing. Mounting this cooler in compliance with Lian Li's diagram, I couldn't do it, and the result was messy. The other point I raised on the subject of cooling in my review is that according to Lian Li, this case will support a 280mm cooler. You have to mount the fans at the top, the cooler below. I couldn't find a way to get that to work in the first instance. I'm going to have a second stab at that. So for this second look at the Q58, I'm changing the motherboard. Going to look at the Gen 4 as a consequence. I'm going to try air cooling. Going to sort out, if I possibly can, 240mm AIO cooling and make it tidier. And also going to take a look at 280mm AIO. Installing the Noctua NH-L9x65 SE AM4. That's a mouthful of a name. CPU cooler on the Gigabyte motherboard is an absolute doddle. It's held down with 2 screws. The fan clips in place, and we're ready for action. Install the G.Skill DDR4 memory, and we're good to go. I'm also installing a pair of Noctua Chromax NF A14 PWM fans in the roof of the case. These are 140mm fans with a maximum spin speed of 1500 RPM, and as you'll see, I'm connecting them to the PWM fan hub at the rear of the case. With the fans running at full speed, the system is rather noisy. That's a nominal 1500 RPM for the case fans and 2500 RPM for the CPU fan. The snag is, the CPU temperature isn't so great. It's not a lot hotter than with the all-in-one, but remember, the temperatures you're seeing are deltas and the CPU is now bouncing off 90 degrees Celsius actual, which means it's throttling ever so slightly and pulling 133 watts and running at 4.4 GHz all cores. We shouldn't lay the blame on the Noctua because it isn't rated for 140 watts. Nothing like in actual fact, although Noctua doesn't use TDP ratings, they use their own power ratings. There is a solution. We can go in the BIOS and use eco mode. The CPU is now running at 65 watts nominal, and when it's under load, this means it's running at about 4 GHz all cores. So we're losing 10% performance. When we look at temperatures, this is CPU only, we're ignoring graphics here. We can see the clock speed has dropped by 10% and the temperature has absolutely plummeted. This is a perfectly reasonable setup for an ITX build, and you can easily imagine that you could run the fans considerably slower and make it much quieter in the process. Using the Noctua air cooler means we have quite a decent amount of space inside the chassis. But when we look closely, we can see there is now fresh air, which is why it made sense to me to install these fans in the roof of the case, because airflow is actually a thing in this case, depending on the hardware you have installed. But if we go to the bottom of the case, this cover can be used to install either a fan or a hard drive stroke SSD. But as you can see, the cables from the SFX power supply are absolutely going to be in a fan. I'm not saying it's impossible to secure those cables in some way, shape or form such that you could put a fan there. But in practice, as I said in the original review, I don't think it's likely, and now I've taken a closer look, I'm going to say maybe in theory, in practice, forget about it. But now it's time to get back to all-in-one liquid cooling. When I used the Fractal 240 previously, it was messy. Question is, can I do a better job? And also, is it possible to put a 280 AIO in the Q58 as the spec tells me? This is a tidier setup than I used in the original review, partly because I've pulled the power cables under the power supply, but also because I've switched out the Trident Z Neo memory for some Corsair Vengeance LPX, because it needs to be low profile to allow the cooler hoses to basically go inboard further. This routing hoses down, around and back, fair enough. There might be a liquid cooler out there that can do that. This Fractal is not that cooler. But overall, we've ended up with, as you can see, an installation where the cables are inboard of the chassis, which means I can put the panels on and it should all be neat and tidy. As to whether it makes the blindest bit of difference to the cooling itself, that's a different question. Tidying up the installation of the Celsius Plus S24 Prisma makes the system look far more neat and tidy, and we don't have to resort to messy cable ties to hold the hoses in place. You will also note the pump body is now the correct way up, so we don't have the annoyance of that logo shining at us in the wrong orientation. However, temperatures do not change at all. The system is tidier, but it works in exactly the same manner. That's the 240mm AIO put to bed, and now we need to give the 280 a try. This is the 240mm cooler I've just removed from the Q58, and this is the top bracket to which it was attached. I remove the cooler and replace it with the 280, and it doesn't go in. It's far too large to sit in the radiator rack, therefore, as I said in the first review, I didn't see any way to install a 280 AIO in the Lian Li Q58. However, Lian Li says the thing is to mount the fans above the radiator and then all should be good. So let's swap the hardware around and see what happens. Well, that looks like it might be a goer. Clearly, I need to screw the whole shooting match together and see whether or not I can install this assembly in the Q58. Here we go then. How are we going to do this? Let's feed that through there. Clearly I was too ambitious attempting to install the pump radiator unit and the bracket and the fans. Let's just try and put the radiator and pump unit in. Let's feed that through there and let us sit the radiator in place. It doesn't go. It just doesn't go. This is ridiculous. I think I'm going to have a look on the shelf and see which other 280mm AIOs I have, because this is not going to go. Corsair H115i, a classic 280mm AIO. Looks more likely to go in this chassis than the Fractal. That is not going to go in there. Can I install it if I put it all in from the bottom? No. Nope. My official verdict is there might be a 280 AIO out there on the market of which I'm unaware, but this hardware, I don't think it's got a chance. And that seems like a sensible point to end this second look at the Lian Li Q58. I'm going to go back to my pros and cons from the original review and see how they stand up. Pros: stylish good looks, particularly those split side panels. Yep, agreed. Still true. The Q58X4 and W4 models support PCI Express Gen 4. Hurrah! Yes, they do. Changing the motherboard, it ran benchmarks, no trouble whatsoever, full Gen 4. So that's good. Support for a full-length triple-slot graphics card. Still true. I'm still not sure how valuable that is, but it is absolutely true. Clever design gives a choice of ATX or SFX power. Also true. I still would stick with SFX despite the cost because ATX in this chassis, that's a headache. Cons: cable management is difficult. Installing an AIO means you have to find a path for the coolant tubes. It's doable, as I've demonstrated. The 240 AIO can indeed be installed neatly. 280 AIO, forget about it. You have to remove the top panel to gain access to the SSD caddy or open the side panels. That's true, and also in the course of pulling this panel on and off a number of times, I've wrenched off one of these pop pins, which looks to me to be, I think it'd be friction welded in place, possibly it's some sort of impact. Maybe it's banged into place. Anyway, it's broken. But then I have taken this panel on and off more times than the average owner is going to do in a lifetime. So not the end of the world, but not ideal either. And my final con, we want to see a version that's full mesh, although some people may want full glass. Yep, full mesh for me, please. The installation of the low profile Noctua air cooler worked. However, a decent processor is going to have to run in 65 watt mode to give that a chance of working correctly, and I would assume it's a similar story with other supported low profile coolers. 240mm AIO absolutely fine, 280mm AIO, I'm just saying it's not a thing. Custom loop, I have no intention of doing this. Yes, I know certain reviewers have done some very nifty builds in this chassis. For me it just seems like one heck of a lot of work for minimal return, but if you want to do that, good luck, fill your boots. Second look of Q58, all done.